Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10, top 10 worst faction members. Basically, as we know as wrestling fans, there have been tons of factions throughout the years. This is my opinion of the 10 worst faction members. Now, my criteria for this takes into effect a couple different things. The wrestler in the faction, not anything they did outside of the faction. So you could have somebody that's a legendary wrestler, great career, but had a bad run in a faction. Their overall fit in the faction, so say someone doesn't fit perfectly in a faction, like for instance, Doink the Clown would not work in the Bloodline, but separate, the Bloodline's great. Doink is great. You get my point here. With that being said, let's jump into number 10. I would say this is probably going to be one that I get the most backlash on, and that's Sting in the Wolfpack. Look, I love Sting. I just made a video recently about my 10 favorite Sting matches. He's an absolute icon and a legend. The reason for this, inherently, the Wolfpack is still NWO. You got the NWO Black and White, the NWO Wolfpack. And the Sting story arc, he should have never joined the NWO or a subset of the NWO. Sting should have always been the guy fighting against that. And that's not to say he didn't have good matches or a good run in the Wolfpack. I just don't think the fit was perfect. As fun as the Wolfpack was, I think it would have been better for Sting to stay the White Knight of WCW and not be just another guy in the Wolfpack. Just my opinion. That's why he made my list. I'll go from that on number 9. Jake Hager in both the Jericho Appreciation Society and the Inner Circle. And I'm not knocking Hager, aka Jack Swagger. I think he's a good wrestler. I think he could be used well in a role that they were seemingly going with this. The thing of it is, in both these groups, which are kind of an extension of each other, Hager never really felt like a threat. He never felt like the enforcer he was supposed to. If we're going to liken the Inner Circle or the Jericho Appreciation Society to something like Evolution or the Four Horsemen, where you have enforcers like Dave Bautista or the enforcer, Arn Anderson, he doesn't really fit into that role, where this should have been the role in both of these groups. He should have been the guy that was in the run for the TNT Championship, the guy that you had to wrestle to get to Jericho, the guy that always made the odds in Jericho's favor. Now, to me, he feels more like a wasted opportunity, and that's why I think he deserves to be on this list. I'll go from that on number 8. Visera in the Ministry. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not hating on Big Vis, and I do think there are some aspects of it when he morphed it into the world's largest love machine that I liked the character, but this was another case of you had a guy on the roster, so you just did something with him, and the Ministry was kind of bloated and overfilled anyway. I mean, if you think about it, you had The Undertaker, you had Mideon, you had the Acolytes, technically the Brood was part of the Ministry, and you got a guy like Mideon, and then you got a guy like Visera. Visera to me never really felt like much of anything other than to fill a spot in the card, to put him and Mideon in tag team matches to represent the Ministry, but they already had a tag team with the Acolytes, so why would they need this tag team? Sure, he looked imposing, he looked impressive, but so does The Undertaker. I mean, there's no more imposing wrestler in the history of wrestling than The Undertaker. Again, this was just another one that, I don't know, they could have done something with it, but it didn't feel like he was anything there. That's why he's here. I'll go from that on number 7. AJ Styles and Fortune. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think AJ Styles is one of the top wrestlers of the last 20 years. Between his work in WWE, New Japan, Ring of Honor, TNA. The guy is an absolute top of the food chain legend. However, Fortune was a group that was basically the Four Horsemen without having the Four Horsemen name, and trying to take AJ Styles and morph AJ Styles into Ric Flair didn't work. Now, there are similarities. They're both two of the top wrestlers of their generation. They're both extremely talented. They're both well loved by the fans. However, when I think of Ric Flair, I think of Rolexes and jets and limousine. When I think of AJ Styles, not so much. And this isn't a knock on either person. You could have just as easily said, I don't see Stone Cold Steve Austin fitting in this role in Fortune. You couldn't make, once he transformed from Stunning Steve to Stone Cold, I don't think you could bring him back to being a Ric Flair type character, and that's kind of what I'm saying with AJ. AJ was so well defined and so set on one thing, and that's not to say he couldn't have had a great heel run. It's just the fact that they tried to make him Ric Flair. They put on the Ric Flair robes, they put him in suits, which he looked great in. It just never felt like AJ Styles, and it never felt like he was comfortable. I just think it was a bad fit for a great wrestler, much like Sting in the Wolfpack. Now going from that, our number 6. Crush and the Nation of Domination. The Nation of Domination had a few different incarnations, a ton of different members, whether it be PG-13, Savio Vega, The Rock, D'Lo, The Godfather, Farouk, and that's not including all the members that were part of the group in the USWA. The one guy that didn't feel like he fit was Crush, and the reason for that is all these other people, PG-13, D'Lo Brown, Kama Mustafa, The Godfather, Farouk, Savio even, you felt like they were guys that you could find in a street gang in a certain way. Whereas Crush felt like he came from a biker gang, which is obvious when they split off and they did their different gang war thing. For what they were doing and the somewhat racial overturns of what it had, the Nation of Domination was basically a Nation of Islam algorithm on WWE. Crush doesn't really fit. And it's not because he's white, because PG-13 fit. Owen Hart, when he was there, fit pretty well. Owen wasn't perfect, but I think his fit was better than Crush because he had a reason to be there. Crush was just a guy that I think they liked. They needed to find something to do, some way to update him from the pink and purple Hawaiian Kona Crush to the now fresh out of jail Crush. I don't know, I always thought he stood out like a sore thumb as someone that didn't belong in the Nation, hence why he's here on the list. We'll go from that, our number 5. This is a 2-for-1. Wes Briscoe and Garrett Bischoff and Aces and Eights. If you talk to 20 wrestling fans about Aces and Eights, you're going to get 20 different opinions. This was an angle that ran the gambit from the most ridiculous and stupid things you could ever see on wrestling to some of the best things you could ever see on wrestling, and sometimes within the same show. For all the good twists and turns and team members like Devon, Bubba, Mr. Anderson, D'Lo Brown even. You had members like Bischoff and Briscoe. And I kind of wonder, because you look at the two of them, they weren't terrible in the ring. They were good. They were good-looking guys. It kind of felt like they were on TV before they should have been. If these two could have been put in, like, let's say, OVW or Florida Championship Wrestling or now NXT and developed, you may have had 2 stars. I mean, there was obviously something there with both of them. Both of them have a lineage to legendary wrestling families. And with saying that, when you talk about legendary wrestling families, and you talk about failed siblings, these are 2 that come up on the top of the list. Again, another case of, with all the good stuff in the Aces and Eights, you had some bad in there as well. These 2 make my list. I'll go from that, our number 4. Horace Hogan and the Flock. Now, the Flock was kind of a mishmash, jumbled, misfit team, and you would think you could plug almost anyone into that. I mean, Van Hammer worked in it, Lodi worked in it, Sick Boy, Saturn, Riggs, Kidman. To me, Horace Hogan, even though he had the FMW credibility as someone you would think would absolutely thrive in the Ravens Rules style matches, never felt like he fit. And a lot of it was a visual aesthetic. All these other guys you can believe kind of hung out with each other. They all looked like the people you would see if you went to an Alice in Chains concert, or if you went and see Marilyn Manson or any of the big name alternative bands of the time. Horace always kind of felt like their uncle. He kind of felt like that Steve Buscemi meme, the Hey Fellow Kids meme, and I know you all know it, but in case you don't, there it is right there. He never felt right here. And again, this is no knock on any of these wrestlers, it's just their fit sometimes didn't work. To me, I think it was a wasted spot in the Flock. Maybe they could have used somebody else here. Maybe they could have brought in another person from ECW. Who knows? It just never worked in my opinion. Now, coming from that, our number 3, Bone Soldier and Bullet Club. And no, I'm not talking about Ishimura. I'm talking about the original Bone Soldier, aka Captain New Japan. Bullet Club as a group has had, I think, like 40 members at this point. There have been people in and out of it all through its history. There's pretty much been an entire roster change. I think the only original member now is Bad Luck Fale. All the other members have either went to other companies or have been kicked out of the Bullet Club. And there have been a few members that just never fit. Much like I said with Horace Hogan, with Crushing the Nation, he looked out of place. It might have worked now, might it have been different now that we have a different kind of Bullet Club and it's morphed into something totally different than what it was at the time? Maybe. Probably not though. I feel like Captain New Japan as a character, why it's not the greatest character, it had its place on the card. And putting an undercard talent on the team and keeping him as an undercard talent made him obviously the weak link of the Bullet Club. He was the one that would eat the pins in the multi-man matches. He was the one that if the baby faces were going to get a comeuppance, it would be on Captain New Japan or Bone Soldier. There have been a few other guys that were considered for this that were Bullet Club members. Cody Hall being one. Jeff Jarrett. I mean, even though I like Jeff, what did he really do in the Bullet Club? But when it comes down to it, to me, Bone Soldier is a guy that didn't ever belong in there. Now going from him to another soldier, our number 2, the Disciple in the NWO. Much like the Bullet Club, the NWO had tons of members. I think there was over 40. If you include NWO Japan, it probably easily tops 40. And seemingly anyone and their mother could be part of the NWO. I mean, all you had to do was ask for a shirt and you were NWO. For such a revolutionary group and such a game changer, they had some stinkers as members, like Michael Wall Street, Mike Rotundo, who's a great wrestler, Vincent, aka Virgil, another decent wrestler, the aforementioned Horace Hogan. I know I feel like I'm picking on Horace, I'm sorry. I did enjoy your work. The guy that didn't fit to me the most and seemed like just a guy that was there to stroke Hogan's ego was Hogan's best friend, Ed Leslie, aka the Disciple, aka Brutus Beefcake, the Booty Man, the Man Without No Name, the Zodiac, and one of the 800 other names he went by. In a time where the NWO was serious and dangerous, he made the NWO feel hokey and goofy. All of the worst NWO moments seem to have the Disciple in. When you think about the Hogan and Warrior feud, the Disciple's right there. I don't know, to me he just never really fit here. I get the reason you want to give Hogan's friend a job, but he came off as a Hulk Hogan superfan, which I'm sure he is because the guy gave him millions of dollars. To me, he was the weakest link in one of the greatest factions in the history of wrestling. Now before we get to our number 1, we do something here called the best of the rest. Basically, things that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Max from the Dungeon of Doom. And yeah, I probably could have put the entire Dungeon of Doom on here, but the one thing I will say, at least with the most part of the Dungeon of Doom, there was an aesthetic. They were scary, whether it be Sullivan as a Taskmaster, the Giant, the Yeti, the Faces of Fear, the Shark, the aforementioned Zodiac. They had something in common. They were wrestlers or gimmicks that were meant to strike fear in. Max, aka Max Muscle, I don't think he ever struck fear in anyone. I mean, he looked like $1 million. He was a decent enough wrestler, but he just didn't fit. Much like I said with Horace and the Flock, it just was a gimmick that didn't work with the gimmick of the Dungeon of Doom. Which, say what you will about the Dungeon of Doom, at least they stayed to an aesthetic for the most. Now last but not least on the best of the rest, Michael Tarver from the Nexus. I could have easily went with Daniel Bryan here, being he was only in the Nexus technically for one night, or Husky Harris or Skip Sheffield, who were in the Nexus but then would go on to be bigger stars outside of it as Ryback and Bray Wyatt. But to me, the least consequential and least effective member of the Nexus was Michael Tarver. He never felt like he was going to win any match. And if I close my eyes, I can't think of a great Michael Tarver moment. Maybe he was in the background from other people's great moments, or Nexus great moments, but when I think back, I could think of good stuff that Wade Barrett did in the era, good stuff that Justin Gabriel did, Heath Slater, David Otunga. They all had good moments while parts of the Nexus. Tarver, what did he do? For that reason, he was considered, didn't quite make it because much like the Dungeon of Doom, I think the Nexus was a group that was good in concept but wasn't great on television. But before I do get to my number 1, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. If If you see where it says join, that's how you become a channel member. Becoming a channel member definitely helps out. With that being said, our number one worst faction member, Paul Roma, in the Four Horsemen. Paul Roma was a guy that was a great wrestler. When you put him in the ring, he was fantastic. His teams with Arn Anderson as the Horsemen, or Hercules Hernandez, or Paul Orndorff is Pretty Wonderful, were all fantastic. Even his Young Stallions team with Jim Powers was a good team. The problem with Paul Roma as a Horseman is the Horsemen at the time, and still to this day, were considered the elite of pro wrestling. The top 4 guys in wrestling. When they initially founded, all 4 members were champions. For the most part, all 4 members of the Horsemen were either champions or contenders to be champs. And that's all through their history. I mean, just look at all the legendary Hall of Famers that were there. Ole and Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Ric Flair, Sting, Sid Vicious, Barry Windham, Lex Luger, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Brian Pillman. These are wrestlers that you think are on top of their game, that are top of the food chain. And Roma had the talent. Don't get me wrong, he had the talent, he had a great look to him, he was a good looking man. He would have fit everything that it would have been to be a horseman. One problem. For about 5 years or so before he joined WCW, in WWE, he was very much an enhancement / lower card talent. He was a guy that when you debuted someone like Skinner or Coco Beware or Mr. Perfect, they would beat him. If you needed someone to be squashed by a giant like Yokozuna or Earthquake, they would feed Paul Roma to him. He was that kind of talent, kind of like the Brooklyn Brawler. And I know that it's not 100% carryover from what was being done in WWE and WCW, and the fans didn't carry over from both with 100%, but there was enough of a carryover fan base. Let's say it's 20%. Say 20% watch both wrestling shows. Those 20%, when they're watching WCW, they're going to tell their friends that don't watch WWF, this is a guy that for years lost to everybody on television. Now you're telling me he's one of the top guys in the company? Do you see where my problem is with it? He didn't have the credibility needed to be a horseman. He just felt like someone that really had all the potential in the world. And I think Power and Glory is probably my favorite run of his, with him and Hercules. Even with that, they weren't portrayed as a threat to any of the tag team championships in WWE. He had a spot, and his spot was well needed. You need guys like Paul Roma on the bottom end of the card, and maybe if you didn't build him up as such, you could have had him here, but that stink was already on him. And I don't think no matter what rub you gave him as a horseman, it never would have washed off. Just my opinion. But let me know what you think. Do you think I put somebody up too high, somebody too low, left somebody off the list altogether? Let me know what you think down here in the comments. If you made it here to the end, let me know your opinion on the worst member of any wrestling faction. Put that down here in the comments. And with that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.